Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet. Still wrapped in a pandemic, overheating, and in an information maelstrom, to use a phrase that Marshall McLuhan coined decades ago, looking ahead to where we are now. And in a way, today's show is looking ahead and trying to figure out, as so much that we do and communication around climate is to sort of get the future into the room today so people can make decisions not just based on current experience or on all the biases that are in our heads and in our communities and in our structures, but to actually have future risks and possibilities ingrained in how we choose to act today. I'm starting with a clip that I recorded yesterday with Sasha Lucioni and colleague Victor Schmidt from Mila Quebec. It's a organization of about 500 scientists working on the frontiers of machine intelligence and artificial intelligence, trying to figure out how to use these tools to foster progress that can fit on a finite planet. They're in the green room enjoying the coffee and hors d'oeuvres. And they're going to come on in a few minutes. But I wanted to start with this video we recorded yesterday under embargo. Their new tool for capturing some of what can happen through flooding, fire, and pollution. And when you look at your address in a computer, if you go, you can go to this to their tool, and we'll learn a lot more about this in a minute, which is thisclimatedoesnotexist.com. You go to that link, and you can explore what your actual environment, your home, perhaps if you're in a part of Google Maps that has Street View pictures of your house. And they use the machine intelligence to sort of paint onto that landscape the changes that are already unfolding in some parts of the planet and are coming. So I'm going to just play the video. And it goes for about 15 minutes, and then Sasha and Victor will join us live to answer questions you might have.
Can you describe Mila just very briefly?
Sure, it's a research institute, an AI research institute based out of Montreal, and we pursue fundamental work in artificial intelligence and machine learning, and also applied projects. And us particularly, we're a part of a branch of Mila called AI for Humanity, which aims to apply AI techniques to societally beneficial projects.
And Victor, what's your job there?
I'm a third-year PhD student, so I started early 2019 on this very project, actually.
Fantastic. And Sasha, I didn't actually ask your role.
I'm a postdoctoral researcher, postdoc.
So I'm going to go back in time just a second here, and then to build the context, and then we'll get into the tool. For years now, as mapping and data sets have expanded, I keep feeling like we could have what I called a few years ago on Twitter a future slider. You know, Google Maps has a time slider that takes you through Landsat data from 30 or 40 years ago to now. But it's like, what lies ahead? How can we clarify that? And Steve Strader and others have been doing good work on taking us to the now and showing us maps of risk, not just maps of activity. And I keep thinking, like California, this was a 2014 paper showing wildfire risk across California. This is a map of existing zones of severe wildfire risk, right? And this paper did an anticipatory analysis of home building, and and they found, we expect by 2050 that 645,000 homes will be built in areas currently designated as very high wildfire severity zones, right? You know this, right? Because what's driving you, I think, is this same sense of, can we get ahead of ourselves? Can we use information to divert these trajectories? So that's why, again, I'm excited to see what you're doing. Just one more example was the New York Times did a recent piece using satellite imagery to show just how fast we're building. And, you know, can be okay if you're building in a zone that's designed for fire, designed for coastal risk, but that's not the case in many places. Climate Central, really innovative climate communication group working with scientists, came out with a new tool that's pretty cool. just this week, and it's basically they've taken 180 coastal cities and shown sort of a now and to come images, which are again pretty cool. But that's not my house. That's not your house. It's not my neighborhood. It's 180 high-profile landmarks that they've done a fairly straightforward analysis showing this is basically a current policy track. So let's get back to your tools. So could just describe briefly, and I'll start to enter in an address and stuff. But how did you frame the challenge and how did you carry it out? Tell us what we're looking at here. Maybe Victor first.
Yeah, and also I'd like to just go back on one thing you said earlier, which is a risk map. I think this is one of the challenges we faced, and we chose to drift away from that approach of the problem. This climate does not exist. Is empathy driven. The goal here is to try and get you to see, realize, understand, relate to what happens to others, either elsewhere in the world or sometime in the future. But it does not rely on climate predictions. This is basically going to render our visualizations, whatever the address, provided it's available in Google Street View's API. So that's one key difference. We started off actually aiming at using climate predictions and possibly adapting the visualizations to those predictions. We faced very many challenges. The main ones are, first, we want the core idea here is that it should be personalized, relatable, and therefore the resolution of the predictions should illustrate that. So if you have a prediction grid from your climate model of, I don't know, 10 by 10 kilometers, that's very good at the scale of the Earth, but at your scale as a human being, that's super large. That's going to encompass, especially in cities, that's going to encompass thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And so resolution was a challenge. And then we also thought, well, what do we do with people who are in lower risk areas? Like, do we not render anything? Is the message, well, you're fine. There's nothing you need to do about climate change.
That's interesting, yeah.
So there are many other arguments, but those are two important ones. Why we decided to go with empathy, with relating to others, closing the gap, the distancing gap, both spatially and temporally. Right, I've said a lot. Sasha, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that what we were talking about, what Andy was mentioning about constructing, building houses in places where it's a wildfire risk, it's definitely, the information is there, and I think people even know it. I mean, people will tend to know that this is, like, for example, a flood-prone region or a fire-prone region, but it's not quite the same when you see it on a paper and when you actually see your house that you want to buy or build surrounded by wildfire smoke or surrounded by water. So it's really this. I feel that it's like a missing link in our brains between, like, you're at risk written on paper and you're at risk seen on an image.
And I assume, so your team encompasses both the programming skill, the AI, the basic skills in mapping and rendering images, and but also in behavioral science, I assume. But let's explore this as I'm putting in an address. I live in the Hudson River Valley, in a village called Nelsonville, which is right next to a riverfront village called Cold Spring. This is all Lenape territory originally, and those of us who live here cherish the way the landscape was tended by those who came before us. So I'm going to throw in here, this is not casting any aspersions on this particular restaurant, but it's on the waterfront in Cold Spring, and this is a chunk of the Hudson River that is tidal. It's actually an arm of the sea. It's more like a fjord than a river. Okay, so here we are. Oh wait, did I do the wrong? How did that come in? It was doing Cold Spring. Hold on. Maybe we'll go back to that one in Iowa. That was interesting.
Well, disclaimer, we're not in control of what the Google Street View API returns.
Oh no, I know. It was reading. It was as I was typing.
Or
in
what the
address.
user inputs.
Yeah, so here we are at Hudson House, and this is what it's like now. It's a beautiful, again, way over 100-year-old building on the waterfront in a village where the sea level was within a certain range for hundreds of years. You'd have storms. This place has been flooded many times in normal weather. And so now we're going to see what happens. So while it's crunching the numbers, and describe what you're doing here. You took images of existing damage. How do you create the what we'll see in a minute?
So, I mean, the most challenging part so there are 3 events we're rendering here. The most challenging part was creating floods. The main reason is basically humans are super good at understanding the physics of water. If I put water in the sky, you're gonna know it's nonsense. We're more rarely exposed to wildfire and smoke, and so we're less acute in spotting the mistakes the AI could potentially do. And also, water rendering should be contextualized, reflections, texture, and so on. So what we did is there are 2 parts in the processing of an input image from Google Street View. One is a model that is going to try to predict where water should go, and the other one is going to paint those locations with water. And the first model is trained using Unity 3D. So that's basically a virtual world used for video games usually. And the second part is indeed trained with data from existing disasters, trying to reproduce the water from floods.
Right. So here we are at Hudson House after a significant flood. And by the way, what I'm looking at here is well within the range of what's possible even now. And it certainly does convey pretty significantly the risk in that place, especially as the odds change. So it sounds like, do you have a favorite address too? What I assume you guys have plugged in some places yourselves in terms of how this you're looking at. Now here you've also got wildfire smoke. These are general visualizations of what those would look like here. And we are in a region that's not prone to wildfire, but we've had to deal with West Coast smoke has been a significant issue here for the first time in my memory. That we had hazy days, not quite this bad, but all that smoke from Western wildfire is definitely becoming a cross-continental issue.
Yeah, and even if this location were not basically susceptible to any of those 3 events, we hope to bring it closer to you. Like, the actual goal here is, even if it's not likely at a given location, visualizing that is going to help you understand what it means for others. So even though you had the West Coast smoke and it was not all that red, but if you had been there, it's likely it would have looked like that. It's easier to relate to those events and really feel, not just understand we're rational beings, but not only, right? So we need to have this emotional connection to the facts, to the events, to the future.
And there were actually studies that were done along these lines, and they found that people really respond more to imagery that they can relate to, right, with regards to the climate crisis, because things like polar bears on ice caps are hard for us as human beings to project ourselves on. I mean, we can feel bad for them, but when we see images of, for example, smog in a city that looks like ours, or flooding in houses that kind of vaguely resemble our own, I think it really becomes more concrete.
Yeah, and so again, anywhere where there's Google Street View images of houses, including your own, wherever you are, you can plug in the address and do this exercise. The other thing I think is valuable on this website is, of course, you do have this action point here. What now? I'm not going to click it yet, but one of the big complaints and not in everything from journalism to activism so far has been you can't, if people are just trying to scare people without a recourse and something to do, that doesn't work. So how important was it for you to build that in, Sasha?
It was central. It was really the key of our tool, because we really didn't want people to leave thinking that it's over, or thinking that, okay, well, this is my life from now on, I'm going to go, off the grid or whatnot. We really wanted them to channel that potentially kind of negative or awareness raising energy into action. And that was always our goal. And we really framed the website to carry people through this experience. It's really an experience. It's not just like, here's an image, go share it on social media, and that's it. It's really like, look at these images, search for several addresses, and then look at all the things you can do. And we went back and forth about, how many actions we put, how many links, do we overwhelm people by telling them all the things that they could do, right? But we still curated a really good list of actions on different levels. So individual, political, collective, all the different ways, because, maybe I'm ready to give up meat and dairy, but someone else would prefer to vote or to get involved in a climate march, or people have different ways of I guess, getting involved in climate related actions. So that's why we wanted to give the full spectrum.
Well, I think that's, again, it's vital. And going forward, tell us a little bit about how, we were just talking a minute ago about how this is really a research opportunity too. I've done several of my webcasts with behavioral scientists. Like, we were looking at the warming stripes video visualizations. That's 150 years of heating as a color. And, remarkably, there isn't a lot of social science or behavioral science yet that says what works or what doesn't work. So how important is it to think of this as a frontier right now, what you're doing?
This is a very important point, because also when we started off this project, when you create a public facing tool, you're never sure what the outcome is going to be. But by providing this tool to political scientists and behavioral scientists, well, at least we had that contribution guaranteed. Like, we're going to be able to help them. And what the team we're working with is doing right now, so Professor Eric Lachapelle at University of Montreal and Thomas Bergeron at University of Toronto. So they are using this tool because it's basically the first tool that enables researchers to test people in a standardized way, and the treatment applied to the groups in the field are always going to be the same, because it's always the same tool. So the problem they faced in the past with previous imagery is that if it's real, it is very rarely close to the users being tested. And if it's not realistic, then if it's fake, usually it's standard. It's basically a set of landmarks, for instance. But that's very different from like your personal experience of climate change. So it's really the first tool that enables them to have a standardized treatment for personal imagery, and see how personalization and visuals are going to be critical in increasing, hopefully, that's the study is on the way, in increasing behavioral intention and actual actions. So it's really a great opportunity for us also to be able to provide this tool and not just do our AI thing in our corner, in our ivory tower, and just, important to share.
Right. So I just put in Santa Cruz, California, the wharf there. There's a tourism spot where people go out on the pier there, and obviously the flood there too will be a challenge, and that's an area that already experiences wildfire and the like. I could foresee this having applications in schools too.
definitely.
Yeah, it's one of our plans, especially it's called high school, right? When it's really about learning about our impact on the environment, and we have actually already have some teachers who are trying to incorporate this in their curriculum, kind of as a way of illustrating climate impacts.
Good. Well, I'd love to keep track of those applications. And
you were asking also earlier about our favorite addresses, and we hope this tool can also be used by activists when you have of any kind, but when you want to enter a conversation about climate change, for example, it's easier if you ground the conversation with some imagery. Like, this is what it could look like. This is what we want to avoid. So be it publicly to address directly politicians, or be it because you're an educator trying to, I don't know, having a presentation in a company or something. Like, you can input the address of the company and ground the conversation into this prime, at least, the conversation with those visuals.
And there definitely is there's an allure to looking at a specific address, like, as you said, where you grew up or where you live now. There's something about that is pretty magnetic about people wanting to try it.
Yeah.
I have one more line of questions about applications. Here in the States, I'm not sure if this is true in Canada and elsewhere yet. One of the big real estate websites, Zillow, now, if you click on a house you're thinking about buying, it, for the first time, they're starting to offer the flood history of the house.
Oh, nice.
And I think that's really important. There are only about half of the states in the United States require disclosure of past flood history. And again, this feels like it's looking at the same kinds of questions. FEMA, the disaster management agency, has just updated its flood insurance program, how they assess what a specific property, what the risk is for specific places. It had been locked into a static kind of thing for a long time, where the 100-year floodplain was a sort of a given as opposed to changing. And now they're changing the way they do their flood risk analysis. And here's the state of Maine, where my mother-in-law lives, and we spend a lot of time. And you can now start to get a more granular picture of which zones are along the coast are going to have more trouble. So I think what you're doing relates powerfully to those ideas as well. And it's great that Mila is involved in this. You have some pretty high-powered brain power there. AI generally is a tool for better or for worse. We keep hearing about the dark side of AI. And this feels like it's very much the upside. So thanks so much for popping in. And
Andy, you're muted.
That never happens on this show. So here I am, Andy Revkin. That last section was recorded yesterday. I wanted to catch Sasha and Victor from Mila Quebec, the AI for Humanity project there, while I could. And now here we are. And here's Marco Tedesco, a good friend and colleague from Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, who's really, he's about as passionate as anybody I know in science who's trying to do the same thing, figure out. He's been up on the Greenland ice sheet with little robotic vessels going to on those lakes that form on the ice. He's looking at sea level questions. He's working with the financial industry to try to get climate risk into the way they make decisions. And I thought it'd be great to connect him with you too here before we close out. And we're going to see if there's any questions coming in from the audience, but I have plenty more.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Andy.
Nice so Marco, you got to, yeah, Marco, could you fill them in and the audience in on your, just give a thumbnail sketch of your work?
Well, Andy, as you mentioned, my specialty was polar regions with emphasis on Greenland, mass balance, and the contribution to sea level rise. how the changes in atmospheric circulation in the Arctic is impacting all these processes and how this links bridges with the mid-latitudes. And on the other side, I'm a remote sensing and modeler expert. As Andy also mentioned, I did fieldwork in Greenland over the past 10 years and in Antarctica about this. But over the past 5-6 years, I've also been collaborating with the Columbia Business School and recently with the Data Science Institute. The idea is and was to basically make my skills at service of some of the climate justice questions. And I wondered, what do I do? I try to approach the problem of the science question from an applied science rather than basic science. And so I asked myself, what might be needed for people, communities, or simple users who are not trained in the climate science to, in terms of tools, to be basically able to be more sensitive or be more capable of pushing their actions further. And because I'm a scientist, I'm an engineer, so data production was the first came. It was during the pandemic. And so we, together with Caroline Hultquist and Lamont and Susan here, put together this data set that we call Spur, and it's based on all publicly available data. I was having an email exchange this morning with Andy, and that's why I'm here, basically. The Spur data set is really not rocket science in the sense that one of the things that I faced in Greenland was the data poorness, of course, of information. And it's very similar in some areas when you start looking at social vulnerability related to climate, especially when it comes to minorities, underrepresented groups, and when you start digging into more racial and ethnic questions. And so the thing that I decided to do was to collate this data, because a lot of the data in real estate in finance is commercial, and I didn't like the idea of not being able to validate or assess the quality of the data. So I spent 6-8 months with Caroline harvesting data, and we have these Spur data sets, which it's over the United States, that combines the FEMA risk index together with other FEMA products, the CDC social vulnerability index together with house mortgage data, dissected down to why the mortgage was denied, the applicant gender, race, ethnicity, and all these kind of things. It's all anonymized, of course, and it is by census tract. Then we have eviction data, we have rental property data, and house property sales data, and then we're starting to merge also, of course, other energy. And everything is now being finalized in terms of homogenization by 5 students from the Data Science Institute, and we're going to put it on GitHub. The idea is, of course, to basically go online, put it there, people in an hour, 2 hours course to learn, to basically explore the area and try to come up with some different solutions. And of course, vulnerability depends on the community you're looking at. And the idea behind is that we want to give more emphasis to some questions that go into the details of some specific social classes, so that eventual quantitative data can help to move farther with some social science.
So that's pretty exciting, and it reminds me of the other work that we focused on yesterday, and that launched this week, is Climate Central, which has done a new sea rise visualization. They just have 180 places around the world, a couple of landmarks that show, based on their peer-reviewed work, these different futures for a 3-degree warming and a 1.5 degree warming. So the two approaches here, the one that Sasha and Victor and everybody is doing, you guys it sounds like you decided to go for the heart and not, it would be really hard to do what you've done with the visualizations and have in it the amount of PM 2.5 pollution that would be likely in 2040 or the like. I think so. You were going for the heart. The Climate Central work is kind of an in-between thing. They sort of have 2 scenarios for sea level rise, but only 180 locations. So they're not latching onto your personal fate. And Marco's talking about even more dimensions of data that are incredibly important in terms of vulnerability. Vulnerability reduction over and over again as a climate reporter, I realized I spent too much time talking about climate change and not enough about climate vulnerability. So I wonder, you know, we're going to spend some more time before we're done exploring the tool that's just rolled out today. But is there a frontier here that could be discussed? You know, something we could work on together going forward? Sasha, I don't know how that all feels to, you know, what else are you guys working on there too? I know that is relevant.
Something that we haven't been able to figure out is how to plug in climate modeling into our tool, because there is definitely a connection, but it's tricky because, you know, climate models are usually on a higher level than an individual address. And so downscaling climate modeling is tricky. And also, for example, floods, they'll tend to be characterized as once in 50 years or once in 100 years. And how do you tell someone that this can be your house, maybe once in 100 years, maybe in 2050, right? And so there's this whole communication aspect that we still haven't figured out, essentially.
And even sea level rise is still deeply uncertain on the scale of the next 50 or 75 years. It's very different outcomes, even just in the variability, even in the understanding of ice sheet dynamics, not just in the variability of emissions outcomes. So that would make that a challenge, I think. Marco, does that feel right in terms of sea level? I mean, it's one of the challenges I see.
I think, Sasha, that's a great point. Victor, congratulations, by the way. I think I play with the tool when Andy sent me a link, and I put my address right away. So it's very,
of course. That's what I like about it.
Perfectly done. Congratulations. I was actually thinking the same thing. Maybe there's some help from the modeling community. If you were able to, I'm not a GAN expert, but we are using GANs. So for some of our work to create high resolution maps of melting in Antarctica. So I was wondering if you can do some physically constrained GANs, and so that maybe you can drape some of the model outputs, even if you try to be more simplistic, but at least you know if it's based on like very basic hydraulic equations, and then maybe you can do that. But I understand it's hard because GANs, once they're trained, also you will have to train for different depths. Then you will have to. It requires a full architecture behind. But one thing that I was thinking, and if I might say, your example of the spatial scale is very important. I think we don't know yet the actual spatial scales and the transfer and the functions related to different damages at different scales, also because the data is at different levels. But the one thing I was thinking, with our data set, we can, for example, identify places where there is more African Americans at risk, for example, of heat waves in some areas of New York, and maybe or flooding in for Latinos, for example. Or for a minority population in general. It would be nice, or it would be one way to connect is some of those addresses that are most at risk, and we can also try to merge with the building information in a way that it's called machine learning does, so that then some of those buildings can be used as to be visualized as a part of the communication mechanism and a potential impact of the data set. So if you go to a community and you see that their building is in a certain way, then your community organizer, you can show how it look like your area. And so that connects a little bit the two data sets and could be part of a training to use their tool to visualize the last part of, we actually try to have a workshop here at Columbia in a few months about this. So this is, I was thinking could be a good connection. I don't know what
I have one, let me add one more question, and then maybe both Victor and Sasha can respond. You have this the smog visualization, and I'm just, by the way, a watcher, Steve Salmoni, who's someone who used to post on my old .earth blog many times about population. He put in an address, so while we're talking, I'll go there because I can show you the what I was thinking. Let's go to smog, even though we're talking about. That's a coastal address. So there we go. My wife works with students and teachers where they use local PM 2.5 meters to check the levels of sooty pollution. And I could see a different version of this eventually that's sort of like could be more real time. You know, it's about another thing to visualize, another thing to be passionate about, another thing to have empathy build around. would be the uneven landscape of risk. So it's not, we're talking of the future here, not next week, but a tool that could actually show some of those disparities. So you know that your neighbor, 10 miles away in the same city or 2 miles or even a block away has more vulnerability. Might be a cool way to go too. So anyway, there was a lot laid on you just then. So maybe Sasha and then Victor, you could chat a little bit about some what you just heard.
Climate justice is definitely a big issue. And even, something that people have said is like, oh, I live on a hill, so I'm okay, right? Like, that's not the point. But I think that sadly, I guess, as human beings, we tend to focus on ourselves. I don't want to call it selfish, but we're, I guess, self-centered as individuals, as kind of a human race. I think what helps is situating people within a global, like a more global picture, right? Like, what do we eat? Where do we go? I don't know. Where are the tomatoes that we eat? Like things like that can help people get above and beyond the "I live on a hill, I'm fine" kind of mentality. So I think there's a way of contextualizing things that kind of helps.
And can I make a comment about the potential use? I don't know if you wanted to go into the question. We know the heat wave is responsible for most deaths in general in terms of hazards, but of course floods also. A lot of deaths in the case of flood or injuries, they occur because people don't know how to behave. Where to go? Do I go into the garage? Do I cross this place when it's just water, but in reality it's mud that is flowing very fast, so it's very powerful. So it's really an experience. I was wondering maybe some applications could be also, if you visualize your area, your address flooded, you have a better idea of what kind of routes you might want to go instinctively in the future. I don't know.
That's interesting. Yeah, just in terms of people who have been driving into flooded areas.
Legally for the choices of people, but it could be a sort of, if you can make also 3D, for example, in the future, of those aspects with the models, then you can start doing also some interesting exercise for these kind of things. And it just came to my mind because I was thinking there is events in New York where people died because clearly an experience about hazards in those cases.
So Victor, what does that feel like in terms of the programming challenge and the data challenge?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say. It's in terms of programming and the algorithms that you have to think about and develop and so on. Like, none of that seems unachievable, given enough time, I think, and brains. I think the data challenges are what would be the serious obstacle to those kinds of endeavors. Like, for instance, if you try to map smog intensity to an image, or the concentration of some pollutants to the way the smog actually looks, you're going to require a lot of data that I'm not sure exists. And that's just one example. And to put the project in context, I think one of the constraints that we put on ourselves was we want this to be a global tool. We don't want to put so much effort just for basically Western people looking up their addresses. It's not just about that. Also, as Sasha said, it's a tool for everyone to realize that just because it's not going to affect you doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing something.
Right.
And so we try to do two things that can sound opposite, which is take you out of the equation and put you in the center of it at the same time. Like, it's not about your personal risk, but it's about your personal emotions towards others. Going forward, I completely agree. There are hundreds of possibilities. I think we often lack the data to make those possibilities come true. Just to create the simulation, the flood data set, the virtual world that allowed us to train the model in order to generate floods. That took us more than a year of programming with the Unity 3D, just to train that one model that is not even conditioned on height. that is just one standard 1 meter flood generated all over whatever the address. So yeah, I'm all for great ideas. Often I think the data is going to lack, and it's what you see most often when you think or talk about projects of machine learning in the real world. Like, very few organizations actually have the data to achieve their goals. So
right.
Open sourcing of data sets, codes, models is part of what we can do, but it's probably not enough for many projects.
It's interesting. Yeah. Well, I guess one thing that I think is clear in this arena is what's needed is a lot of experimentation and different dimensions. You know, there's fantastic innovations underway. I'm going to show a little clip of something at the UN, out on the grounds at the UN a couple of years ago that I know Marco will greatly appreciate because it involves olfaction. The one thing you can't produce even with AI is the olfactory experience, the smell experience of being in smoky landscape. But there was an artist, Michael Pinsky at the UN a couple of years ago, who did something very different. So hold on a second. And some nice comments coming in. Aviva Ramani says, interesting idea to make this available in schools. Maybe while I'm loading this image, Sasha, could you repeat a little bit more about how that's going to play out, the educational component?
Yeah, we have a teacher who's developing a curriculum, because essentially when we spoke with a teacher, he approached us when he saw our project initially, and he was like, well, currently there's no space in the existing curriculum for this kind of stuff. Like, it's based on, climate modeling, and most of it is pretty outdated actually, because, it doesn't get updated as quickly as we'd like it curriculums to be. So he's actually developing like a parallel, I guess, a module of the high school curriculum here in Quebec that will help integrate like these kinds of more climate modeling, but on a personal level. And he's using images, like our images. He's going to integrate it into his curriculum, and he says it's going to be a way for the students to get a better handle on like what climate change means for their neighborhood, and allow them to interact with this tool will really help them learn.
Fascinating. So Victor has to go in a couple of minutes for a radio interview. I'm sure it's a busy day there having this roll out. I'm going to be pushing it hard just right after we're off the air. I just want to, let me show this one thing I was going to mention. So this is this artist, Michael Pinsky. It was an installation at the UN. And it's another way to experience the future or actually geographic differences.
So this is immersive art to the max. Different cities, air pollution levels, simulated with perfumes. So this is immersive art.
Oh, wait, it's the wrong one.
To the max.
I had
cities, air pollution levels.
I had a clip lined up where you could actually go into it. Oh, here we go. Hold on.
You're going to go to London, then New Delhi, Beijing, Sao Paulo.
And these are not the actual pollutants.
They're simulated perfumes that were created in Paris.
In Paris, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, John. Nice to meet you. So this is an immersive artwork from Michael Pinsky.
So each one is a different level.
These are different levels of pollution. And guess what? We're not in Norway anymore. Holy moly.
What are we seeing here?
So you're going to start with a region in Norway, and then you're going to go to London.
It was quite an experience. And also it was a very hot day.
Sao Paulo.
And these are not
to
the actual
compound
pollutants.
the experience.
They're simulated perfume.
And to me, it's the landscape of these things. It's the individual artist doing an installation like that, incorporating a sense of pollution, and especially that cool notion of a sense of the density of the pollutant in the air using perfume as a proxy feels fantastic. Of course, you can't do that for hundreds of millions of addresses. And at the same time, what you're doing has, well, you're right, not yet. But what you're doing has the scale and that the draw, as Marco said, everyone wants to put in their address and see, so what's this mean for me? And they're all Climate Central's work that we discussed yesterday is different. It's 180 iconic places. And the other thing, I didn't have time to bring on some social scientists, but I did a couple of sessions here recently on the basically the gap in understanding. There's still pretty significant lack of understanding of what changes behavior. This goes back to hand washing. The history of public health is all basically behavior change. And we've seen how hard that is even with the pandemic. So Victor, before you go, maybe if you have any last thought on that, and then thank you for being here today.
Yeah, I think the clip that you showed is really amazing. That's really a great idea, and I think that's one way we need to go forward with. As I said in the clip that you showed earlier, the pre-recorded one, I think we need to go beyond rational thinking. That is definitely required, but I think we've seen it's not enough. We need an array of ways to convey that message. Public health is a good example of how hard it is for something that is actually quite simple to understand compared to climate change and the thousands of physical processes at stake and time scales and spatial scales. So yeah, I'm really a fan of what you just shared. I'm gonna try and find it on Twitter. I'm a big fan of not basically essentializing humans as rational minds. Partly, but not only.
Yeah. Well, that would be you're being very rational, knowing that we're irrational.
Maybe.
No, there's.
No, but I think the dichotomy that is between the body and the mind. Maybe that's a French bias, but that's how we've learned from Descartes in Europe in the 15th century or 16th century. Right? There's the mind that is rational, and then there's the body, there's the feelings that are altering your perception of reality. So there would be this so-called absolute truth that is only based on facts, and that's the only way we should address the world. I think this has limits, especially when you want to tackle such a global challenge.
Bien sûr. And imagine Marco would agree. So Victor, if you have to go, that's fine.
I have a couple of minutes, but okay. Thank you very much for having me here.
So Marco, could you, have you gotten anywhere with your olfactory vision, so to speak?
No, I think Andy's referring to the fact that I approached him a couple of years ago that I wanted to do a project when he was still in National Geographic about collecting smells from the Arctic. And we are actually still trying to pursue that. So whoever is watching, reach out. We have drafted a sort of a white paper with a perfumer artist about the importance of a sort of manifesto of Arctic smells or climate smells. And it's like colors. You can reconstruct smells with some basic prime ingredients, but I think the technology here to transfer this kind of information is still limiting the way we were able to distribute the outcome. So, but I find this fascinating. Yes,
that takes us back. That takes us back to France, by the way, because of Marcel Proust.
Yeah, I mean, and also
his books are all about the visceral nature of smell and memory.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a very well made point. And what Victor, said it resonates with me in the sense that I think a question is about the empathy. Like you mentioned that it's climate empathy, it's COVID empathy. I mean, we have had a chance to see how populations react during the COVID in very extreme environments. But I think how do you translate, how do you increase more empathy in this regard? By Victor, it's very important. So that's a big question.
So Sasha, again, back to you for any reactions. And
yeah, one of the projects that inspired us was one done by the MIT Media Lab called Deep Empathy, and they actually used GAMs once again to generate images of war. And and to raise awareness to like what would have happened if the Syrian war came to Boston or to New York. I mean, they were doing it more on a city level, I guess, like now Climate Central is doing for landmarks. But still, it was really, for me, kind of eye-opening, because it really allows you to take something that you can never comprehend. I mean, I don't think anyone in places that haven't been touched by war can imagine this kind of, right? Like, can you imagine your downtown, your city being wrecked? And for me, that was I do think that, after all, maybe AI does have some positive things to do here. I mean, so that really opened my eyes, because I mean, you can show people images of people affected by war in Syria or other places, but people still think it's not them, and that's a gap that we need to bridge.
Just showing it right now. That's fantastic. And you're reminding me of another discussion I had just a couple of weeks ago with Roman Krznaric, who is a philosopher who wrote the book Empathy. It was a bestseller 10 or so years ago, maybe longer, and who has an empathy museum where people come to the museum, you put on a pair of shoes that were refugees' shoes, and while you're doing that, you're hearing the voice and that kind of thing. I think there's so much potential going forward to play with all these tools. So as always, these discussions I do here are iterative, as Sasha already knows. And Marco, you know enough about me to know that I see everything as a journey, not as a project with an ending. So we're sort of coming toward the end here, but we have a few more minutes. But thinking about next steps is really important, and maybe finding out who at MIT had worked on that, or I could talk to some people I know in the game world, which we haven't talked about yet, to see what can build on this. And again, it comes back to me always to, can we find ways that show this matters? It's not just playing with cool toys, and there it's still that's one of the hardest things I think of all, because some of these things I don't think it'll take too long to know if it mattered, and because of the indirect nature of what inspires people to change decisions and like, I don't know if that engenders any more thoughts from either of you. Do we have to get comfortable with not having everything measurable?
I think I agree with you. The connection from this point to the applied part of the science. You think about physical sciences, social sciences, data science, economic sciences. They're all different sciences, and they have to converge, and they have to be translated through these tools to in actionable items. And I think I agree with you. And you can scream as loud as you want, but if there's no door opening, it's very hard. So I think this is a strength, but it's very valuable. I really wanted to thank Sasha and for the work they did, and I'm very much looking forward to promote it and collaborate eventually. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
It's great to have you both on here today. So Sasha, are there any imminent next steps I should know about before we go, or what people can do? Obviously, everyone should go to thisclimatedoesnotexist.com.
And I would say, honestly, we were grappling a lot about what the most impactful action someone can take is. And because it's so contextual, because, for example, it depends on the car you drive, depending on your diet, depending on where you live. And you can't tell someone to stop driving if they have no other choice, et cetera, et cetera. So honestly, what we converged to was to talk about the issue of climate change, and to bring it up more often, and to say that it matters, and to, I guess it's a form of climate activism, but on a very individual level, to tell people, like, I've become that annoying person who says, like, oh, that, the top however many corporations are responsible for 70% of our emissions and things like that. But, bringing it up, and even if it's awkward, or even people peg you as a climate person, just, I think that the more we talk about it, the more we normalize it, the better, the faster we can take action.
Yeah, and I know that Marco agrees with that too. And Marco, what's the title of your recent book, the one on your work?
Oh, The Hidden Life of Ice.
The Hidden Life of Ice.
Yeah,
Much of that hidden life is being transferred into the hidden life of water.
Advertising, and it's been a long journey, but thanks. Sasha, Andy, do we have 2 more minutes? I was thinking about maybe. So I've been collaborating with a group in Media Lab, and your deep empathy made me reminded them. There's a very active group who've been producing future images of satellites. And basically the way they use GANs, the same thing you did, applying a future simulation of flood from FEMA, from NOAA, and they train their satellite data, modern satellite data, with those model outputs. And so they can actually tell you, for example, how, I don't know, a city will look like in 30 years based on NOAA projections in terms of optical satellite at very high resolution, because they train GANs at high resolution. And I was thinking maybe you could use that to mask out in a fuzzy way some of the water you generate through your 3D, and actually show what will things look like based on their simulations of future satellite images and projections on NOAA for cities. It just came to my mind. That's why I wanted to take those estimates, but I'm happy to follow up offline after this session.
Yeah, that could be an interesting connection to make, honestly.
Yeah, and then you take it up from there with them, because you're both great experts in machine learning. So I have no idea what you guys are saying.
All right.
Well, that's great. No, that's I'd love to end these shows with something to do next. And
a connection was made.
Yeah, bravo. And actually, I think there's an NSF grant that we got here, the LEAP, this LEAP project, an AI climate change modeling project that
it's an SPC. Yeah.
That Mila is involved with. So stay tuned. So this has been a really great episode of Sustain What, the Columbia Climate School. Frequent discussions on issues related to how we turn sustainability into something more than a hashtag, and the work that's being done by Mila Quebec, and also at Climate Central, as I said earlier, and at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, and everyone that Marco works with is a great example of what's possible. Please share this with folks out there when you're done watching. This is recorded. It'll be recorded on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and everywhere else video is made and shared. And so stay well, go out there, envision the future around you, and also go down the block and look for the vulnerability around you that's right here today that can be reduced in real time while we talk about reducing risk in the future. And I've had sessions on here on that already with Andrew Krushevitz, a flash flood expert, and others. Thanks again. Be well, and good luck with this project.
Thank you.